The morning after the ice storm finally released its grip on Crowley County, the sheriff's department helicopter made its first pass over what remained of the town. Buildings had collapsed under the weight of frozen precipitation. Power poles lay shattered across roads that no longer existed under 3 feet of crystallized snow. But through the gray dawn, one structure stood completely intact. A barn on the Garrett property, its walls dark and solid, smoke rising steadily from a concealed chimney, while every other building for 20 miles looked like it had been crushed by an enormous fist. Inside, Margaret Garrett stood beside a propane stove, pouring coffee for 11 neighbors who had spent the last 4 days sheltered behind walls they had spent 6 months mocking. 6 months earlier, Margaret had made a decision that turned her into the most talked-about woman in Crowley County, and not in a good way. It started the morning after a spring tornado touched down 15 miles south, close enough that Margaret heard the freight train roar from her kitchen window. The storm had torn through empty pasture land without hitting anything important, but it left her staring at her 100-year-old barn, imagining what would have happened if the funnel had tracked just slightly north. The barn was the largest structure on her property. Solid timber frame, good bones, but the walls were standard board and batten that would splinter like kindling under any serious pressure. Most people would have simply accepted that barns were expendable. Margaret decided hers wouldn't be. She started making calls the next day. Contractors, engineers, anyone who might understand what she was trying to do. Most of them thought she was confused about terminology until she explained it clearly. She wanted to reinforce the existing barn walls with a hybrid system: stone on the outside for impact resistance, dense straw bale insulation on the inside for temperature control, all of it integrated with the original structure to create something that could withstand extreme weather events. The first contractor laughed and told her she was describing a fortress, not a barn. The second one quoted her a price that made her mortgage look reasonable. The third one, a semi-retired engineer named Douglas who had worked on storm shelters in Oklahoma, looked at her barn for 20 minutes before saying, "You're serious about this?" "Completely," Margaret said. Douglas walked the perimeter twice, checking the foundation, testing the frame integrity. Finally, he turned to her. "It'll work. But people are going to think you've lost your mind." "Let them," Margaret said. The work began in early May. Douglas brought in a small crew, and they started by reinforcing the barn's foundation, pouring additional concrete footings that extended 4 feet down. Then came the stone, local fieldstone hauled in by the truckload, each piece carefully mortared into place against the exterior walls. The straw bales came next, compressed wheat straw stacked tight against the interior walls, creating an insulation barrier nearly 2 feet thick. People noticed immediately. Of course they did. At the feed store, Harold Vance watched Margaret load fencing supplies into her truck and called across the parking lot, "Building yourself a castle out there, Margaret?" She secured the tailgate without looking at him. "Just making improvements." "Improvements," Harold repeated, loud enough for the man standing near his truck to hear. "That what we're calling crazy projects now?" The laughter followed her all the way to the county road. At the diner, the waitress refilled Margaret's coffee and said, carefully, "Heard you're doing something unusual with your barn." "Reinforcing it," Margaret said. "Against what exactly?" Margaret looked up from her newspaper. "Against whatever comes." The waitress smiled the way people do when they're trying to be polite about something they don't understand. "Well, I'm sure it'll be real strong." By July, the gossip had sharpened into something meaner. At the co-op, women stopped talking when Margaret walked past, then resumed in whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. Online, someone started a Facebook thread about the stone barn lady that filled with jokes about survivalist paranoia and wasted money. Her nephew called from Kansas City. "Aunt Marge, people are saying you're turning into some kind of doomsday prepper." "I'm weatherproofing a barn, Tim. You're stacking rocks around it like you're expecting the apocalypse." Margaret watched through her window as Douglas's crew set another layer of stone. "I'm expecting weather." Which, last I checked, comes every year. The work continued through August. Douglas installed reinforced ventilation systems, upgraded the electrical to support backup power, added water storage tanks in the barn's lower level. The straw bale insulation got sealed behind vapor barriers and finished interior walls. By September, the barn looked almost medieval from the outside, its stone walls rising dark and solid from the prairie, while inside it had been transformed into something that could function as shelter if needed, with climate control, power systems, and storage capacity most houses didn't have. The first cold snap came in October, earlier than usual. Then the weather patterns started getting strange. Temperatures swinging 40 degrees in single days. Forecasts changing hour by hour. By November, meteorologists were using words like unprecedented and historic system to describe what was building in the Arctic. Margaret watched the forecasts and said nothing. She stocked the barn methodically. Propane, food, medical supplies, firewood, battery banks. When the first ice began falling 3 days before Thanksgiving, her closest neighbor, Beth Crawford, stood in Margaret's driveway and stared at the barn. "You really think it's going to be that bad?" Margaret looked at the sky, gray and heavy. "I think we'll find out soon." The ice came like nothing anyone in Crowley County had ever seen. Not in bursts, not in waves, but in a constant, suffocating sheet that fell for 60 hours without stopping, coating every surface in crystalline weight that transformed the landscape into something alien and deadly. It started Thanksgiving morning. Light freezing rain, nothing alarming. By afternoon, tree branches were bending under the accumulation. By evening, the first power line snapped, whipping through the darkness in showers of sparks that looked almost festive until people realized what it meant. Margaret was in the barn when her house went dark. She had already moved most of her essential supplies out here, had already set up the propane heater and tested the backup power system. Through the small reinforced window, she watched ice building on everything, saw her truck disappear under a thickening shell, saw the world outside become increasingly hostile. The sheriff's department sent out an alert at midnight. Stay inside. Do not attempt travel. Emergency services suspended until conditions improve. By the second morning, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees and the ice was still falling. Margaret's house had lost heat completely. The pipes froze despite her precautions. But inside the barn, behind walls of stone and straw, the temperature held steady at 62 degrees. The propane heater barely had to work. The insulation was doing exactly what Douglas had engineered it to do. That afternoon, she heard the first crack. Not close, but loud enough to carry. Then another. Then a sound like artillery fire rolling across the county as buildings began to fail. Roofs collapsing under ice weight. Walls buckling. Structures that had stood for decades coming apart under pressure they were never designed to handle. Margaret's phone rang at 4 p.m. Beth Crawford, her voice tight with fear. "Margaret, our roof is cracking. Jeff says we need to leave, but the roads are impossible. The house down from us just lost its whole back section." "How far can you walk?" Margaret asked. "What? My barn. Can you make it here?" Silence. Then, "Margaret, we made fun of your barn. I don't care. Can you make it or not?" "I think so. Maybe. It's a quarter mile. Bundle up everything warm you have. Wrap your faces. Move slow. Watch for down power lines." Okay. We're coming." They arrived 40 minutes later, ice-covered and shaking so hard they could barely stand. Margaret got them inside and sealed the heavy door. The Crawfords stood in the barn's interior, staring at the space she had created. Finished walls holding back the cold. Propane stove radiating steady heat. Shelves stocked with supplies. Sleeping areas already set up. The stone walls so thick that the sound of ice outside became distant, muffled, manageable. Jeff Crawford's voice cracked. "Jesus, Margaret. You built a shelter." "I built a barn," she said, handing him dry clothes. "Get changed. There's coffee." The Hendersons came next, then old Paul Martinez from the property to the south. By the third day, 11 people had made their way through the ice storm to the only structure in the area still functioning. Margaret organized them with quiet efficiency. Sleeping rotations, cooking schedules, water rationing, heat management. Everyone had tasks because she understood that purpose kept fear from taking over. Outside, Crowley County was tearing itself apart. The ice had reached depths nobody thought possible. 3 inches, then 4, then 5. Buildings were collapsing under loads exceeding 10,000 pounds. Power infrastructure was destroyed. Roads were impassable. The entire region had been cut off, transformed into a disaster zone that wouldn't be reachable for days. But inside the stone-reinforced barn, life continued with remarkable normalcy. The straw bale insulation kept the interior warm using minimal fuel. The ventilation system prevented moisture buildup. The reinforced structure didn't creak or groan or show any sign of stress under the ice weight. It simply held on. The fourth night, Beth Crawford sat beside Margaret near the propane stove while others slept. "I owe you an apology," Beth said quietly. "We all do. You don't owe me anything. We mocked you for months. That Facebook thread, the stuff people said at the co-op. It was cruel." Margaret poked at the stove's flame adjuster. "People mock what they don't understand. It's easier than asking questions. You knew this was coming. I knew something would come eventually. Weather's getting stranger. Systems are getting stressed. I just decided I wouldn't be unprepared." Beth looked around the barn, at the solid walls, the organized supplies, the sleeping neighbors who would have been in serious danger without this space. "The rest of us decided to trust that things would keep working the way they always have." "That's normal," Margaret said. "Most people don't prepare for disasters because disasters feel theoretical until they're not." Through the stone walls, they heard another distant crack. Another building failing somewhere in the frozen dark. "How long can we stay here?" Beth asked. "As long as we need to." When the helicopter finally appeared on the fifth morning, circling low over what remained of Crowley County, the pilot radioed back to emergency command with growing confusion. Most of the town had been devastated. Houses crushed, barns collapsed, buildings destroyed. But in his scope, one structure stood completely intact, smoke rising from its concealed chimney, clearly occupied and functional. The National Guard reached Margaret's property on the sixth day, cutting through ice-choked back roads with specialized equipment. The lieutenant who knocked on the barn door expected to find frightened survivors in a makeshift shelter. Instead, he found 11 people organized, warm, and remarkably calm inside a structure that looked more like a small fortress than a barn. "Ma'am," he said to Margaret, "we're here to evacuate residents to the emergency shelter in Concordia." Margaret glanced back at her neighbors, then at the lieutenant. "Do we look like we need evacuating?" The lieutenant stepped inside, taking in the setup. Temperature-controlled interior. Organized supplies. Power systems running smoothly. People who looked tired but healthy. "No, ma'am. You really don't." "Then we'll stay here, if it's all the same." He radioed back to command. Within an hour, the barn had been designated a functional shelter, and Margaret found herself coordinating with county emergency management instead of being rescued. The news crews arrived 2 days later, once the main roads were partially cleared. They filmed the barn from every angle, interviewed the neighbors who had sheltered there, documented the stone and straw construction that had withstood ice loads that destroyed everything around it. A reporter from Kansas City stood in Margaret's driveway, ice still coating the trees behind her. "Ms. Garrett, people are calling this miraculous. How did you know to build something like this?" "I didn't know," Margaret said. "I prepared. There's a difference. But you faced significant ridicule from your community during construction." "Yes." "How did that feel?" Margaret looked past the camera at her barn, solid and unchanged while the landscape around it looked like a war zone. "It felt lonely. But being right doesn't require an audience." The interview went viral. Within a week, Margaret was fielding calls from engineers, builders, disaster preparedness organizations, and homeowners across the Midwest who suddenly understood that climate instability meant traditional construction methods might not be enough anymore. Douglas, the engineer who had supervised the original work, showed up with a film crew doing a documentary on resilient architecture. He walked the barn's perimeter, examining how it had performed. "Zero structural damage," he said to the camera. "The stone absorbed the ice impact. The straw bales maintained thermal efficiency even during sustained extreme cold. This building could withstand a Category 3 tornado." "Was that the goal?" the interviewer asked. Douglas looked at Margaret. The goal was to stop trusting luck and start engineering for reality. By spring, Crowley County had changed. The rebuilding effort incorporated lessons from Margaret's barn. Building codes were updated. The county engineer's office started consulting with Douglas on resilient construction standards. 3 families rebuilt using stone reinforcement and advanced insulation systems. The transformation was quieter in other ways. At the feed store, Harold Vance approached Margaret while she was loading supplies. "Margaret," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I wanted to say something. About what I said last year. The jokes." She secured a bag of feed. "It's done, Harold." "No, it's not. You saved people because you took precautions the rest of us were too proud to consider. Including me." He finally looked at her directly. I was wrong. About everything. Margaret studied him for a moment, then nodded once. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. The Facebook thread that had mocked her barn got deleted by its creator, replaced with a post thanking Margaret and sharing information about disaster-resistant construction. The apologies came in waves after that, some public, most private. Margaret accepted them without ceremony because she had never been interested in vindication, only in survival. On a warm day in May, Margaret stood in her barn's doorway watching her nephew Tim help repair her house's roof damage. The barn had functioned so well during the crisis that she was converting part of it into a permanent guest space, keeping the shelter systems intact and maintained. Beth Crawford walked up the driveway carrying a covered dish. Brought you some dinner. Figured you'd be too busy to cook. You don't need to keep doing this, Margaret said, but she took the dish. I know. Beth looked at the barn, its stone walls weathered but unbroken. I still can't believe this thing held while everything else fell apart. It held because it was built to hold. You try to tell us. In your way. Margaret shrugged. People hear what they're ready to hear. I just made sure I was ready for what came. That evening, Margaret sat in the barn's interior space, now comfortably furnished, the propane stove providing gentle warmth as spring temperatures dropped. Through the reinforced window, she watched the sunset paint the prairie in colors that felt newly precious after nearly losing everything to ice and cold. Her phone buzzed. A message from Douglas. Getting inquiries from 6 states about the barn design. Want to co-author a construction guide? She smiled and typed back. Let's talk. Because that was the real lesson, she thought. Not that she had been proven right while others were proven wrong, but that survival required looking ahead instead of trusting that the past would simply repeat forever. The world was changing, weather patterns shifting into territory that old wisdom couldn't predict. The people who adapted wouldn't be the ones who refused to seem paranoid. They would be the ones willing to act on uncomfortable possibilities while there was still time. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the barn around her. Solid walls holding back the night. Systems ready for whatever came next. Not a fortress built from fear, but a shelter built from clear-eyed acceptance that preparation wasn't paranoia. It was simply the difference between surviving and enduring. And out across Crowley County, that difference was finally being understood.